In the rugged mountains beyond Wren Valley, where the land was as hardened as the people who lived on it, Eli Mercer chose a life as quiet and forgotten as his name had been for years. A cowboy widowed for 5, with no children, no close kin, Eli lived alone in a weathered log cabin 3 miles out of town, a tin-roofed structure with cracked wooden walls surrounded by dense forest and silence. He didn't need much, just a hot meal, a roof that didn't leak, and the kind of deep stillness only a man who'd survived too much loss could truly understand. The first time Myra Jansen appeared on his doorstep, Eli didn't think much of it. A young woman, maybe late 20s, knocked just before dusk, her head slightly bowed, arms wrapped around a worn cleaning rag. No greeting, no smile, no question about pay. She just looked at him with eyes that seemed long used to never having a choice. Eli handed her a broom and nodded toward the ash-covered kitchen. She gave a silent nod, no words, and got to work. There was something about her that unsettled Eli, not out of fear, but confusion. She worked like a shadow, not fast, not slow, careful but without gentleness. As if each speck of dust she wiped away took something from inside her with it. No sighs, no questions. Even when scrubbing dried blood from the floor remnants of an old coyote that had limped into the cabin during last month's storm, she didn't flinch. She just worked, washed her hands in cold water, accepted the silver coin he left on the table without counting it, then walked off silent, disappearing into the trees like she'd never been there. No horse, no wagon, no one waiting at the road's bend. She walked back into the forest like she'd been born of it. Eli figured she wouldn't return. But 3 weeks later, right at the same hour, that small silhouette appeared again. This time when she left, the silver coin still sat untouched on the table, as if her silence now carried a refusal. By the 3rd visit, Eli started watching her more closely. She moved like someone used to running, not frantic, but alert. Not the kind built for hard labor, but the kind who had no choice in it for too long. Her dress was more patch than fabric. Her boots looked like one more rainstorm might finish them. There were shadows under her eyes, but her spine didn't bend. She didn't look afraid, just like someone who had long stopped hoping. Then one evening, Eli did what he called accidental, though it was anything but. He followed her. There was no trail, no clear path. She weaved through brambles, stepped over twisted roots like she'd done it 100 times. Eli had to dismount halfway, parting branches, heart pounding. Not from exhaustion, but from something he didn't yet want to name. He crested a ridge. What he saw cracked something deep in him. Not a house, just a pit of shelter built beneath the ruins of an old miner's shed. A rusted sheet of tin patched the roof. Smoke curled from a crooked chimney. Children, 5 of them. The oldest maybe 10. The youngest barefoot in the cold dirt. Ragged clothes, tangled hair, bruised skin. But none of them cried. They just moved, cutting wood, hauling water, mending blankets, as if survival had replaced childhood long ago. And in the middle of it all was Myra stirring a dented pot over the fire, her silhouette flickering behind a torn curtain. Eli stood still. His heart, numb since his wife passed, tightened in his chest. Not from pity, but from recognition. Some people choose silence, not because they're weak, but because they've had no one left to speak to. And Myra, the woman who never said a word, was carrying an entire world on her back. A world no one saw, no one asked about. That night, Eli returned home without a word. But the next morning, a sack of flour hung from a nail by Myra's door. No name, no message, no need for thanks. Just a man for the first time in years beginning to think about someone other than himself. Ever since the day Eli Mercer followed Myra's footsteps back to that sagging shelter beneath the ruins of an old mining camp, he never looked at her the same again. She was no longer just a hired hand. Every time she returned to his cabin, he noticed more the weariness in her steps that didn't shake her resolve. The sun-darkened skin on her hands and the way her eyes, though tired, always checked the path home, as if any trail could turn into danger. Eli began leaving more than a silver coin after each visit, sometimes a biscuit wrapped in a clean cloth, other times a jar of honey he'd been saving since last summer. But Myra always took only one thing, never more. The rest she left untouched, as if the line between enough and greed had been carved into her bones. One early winter morning, Eli hung a bundle of old coats on the side of her shack. He didn't know if she'd take them. But the following week, a girl maybe 9 years old showed up alongside Myra, wearing a faded red sweater from that bundle. It was the first time Eli saw the children up close. They didn't smile, but they didn't shy away either. Nathan, the oldest boy, looked him square in the eye as Eli placed 2 warm sweet potatoes on the table. "Thank you," he said, soft but steady. It was the first word Eli ever heard from any of them. Then came the snow. The first winter storm came early and fierce, sweeping through the woods like a whip, breaking branches, blocking trails, swallowing every trace of human presence. Myra still came that day. Her patched coat-soaked scarf dripping with meltwater, she didn't say a word, just lowered her head and began cleaning like always. Eli thought about sending her home early, but by the time he turned from the stove, she was already gone. Snow fell heavier. The wind howled through the canyon like a warning folks out west called the sound of something lost. Eli couldn't rest. He stood on his porch with a cold cup of coffee and eyes fixed on the tree line where she usually disappeared. The sky hung gray and low like a wet wool blanket. He pulled on his coat, mounted his horse, and followed the narrow path toward her shack. By the time he found her, daylight had nearly vanished. She lay beneath a fallen pine snow, dusting her hair lips blue, one leg trapped, and her hand bloodied. "I was heading back," she whispered, as if afraid he'd think otherwise. Eli didn't speak. He just knelt, lifted her gently. She was so light it made him angry. Not at her, but at a world that left a woman carrying so much with so little left to carry it. He took her back to the cabin. Not just her. He returned for the children, 2 wrapped them in thick wool blankets, and loaded them onto the wagon. By the time they reached the cabin, the house was full of breath, the soft shuffling of cautious feet, and the scent of fear seeping into the walls. Eli wasn't used to it. His cabin had long been a container for silence and solitude. But as he looked at the kids huddled near the fire, and Myra unconscious in his bed with her arms splinted, using one of his old shirts, he knew the old quiet was gone. And maybe, just maybe, he didn't want it back. The next 3 days were a cycle of care, thin porridge, boiled water, breaking stale bread into even smaller pieces, wiping sweat from Myra's brow as the fever returned. No one asked for anything. No one complained. Nathan chopped wood. Lisa, the girl in the red sweater, stitched a torn blanket using a dull needle and steady hands. The children moved through the cabin like shadows with names quiet, watchful, thankful in ways words couldn't express. On the 4th morning, Eli rose in the dark to stoke the fire and found a sight that made his chest tighten. Clara, the youngest, fast asleep, thumb in her mouth, her head resting on Myra's leg. Myra was awake, eyes on the ceiling, still and quiet. She whispered, "I told you not to follow me." Eli said nothing. He just knelt beside her and adjusted the bandage on her arm. "You should have left us," she murmured. "I did." Once he answered, voice low enough to be buried beneath the crackling wood. Myra didn't speak again, but her gaze in that moment, no longer guarded, no longer afraid, was the first time she allowed herself to stop running. And something began to shift in Eli. Not quite love, not duty, something quieter, something like connection, the kind that doesn't need to be spoken to be understood. The kind that happens when 2 people survive the same storm and realize, this time they don't have to survive it alone. That winter stretched longer than most. Snow blanketed the hills all the way through March, weighing down the cabin roof in layers of silence that felt harmless at first. But after the storm passed, once the children began to recover, once Myra's cheeks regained color and her steps grew steadier, Eli started to see it. Not all quiet is peace. One afternoon, as they all sat around the dinner table, Myra lifted her gaze. Her voice was as even as always, but her eyes cut through the room like wind through dry timber. "If man ever comes here asking about me," she said, "don't let him in." Eli's fork paused midair. His eyes locked on hers. "Who is he?" he asked. "My ex-husband," she said. "Roland Jansen." Just 3 words. But they dropped onto the table like a cold blade. No one touched their food after that. That night Eli didn't sleep. He sat by the dwindling fire, Scout curled at his feet, ears alert, eyes open. Outside, the wind howled through the trees like a warning. And inside his mind, the shape of a man he'd never met began to take form, carved from every bruise Myra had tried to hide, every cautious glance Lisa gave strangers, and the way Nathan always stepped between his mother and the door. The next day, Eli rode into town. He didn't tell Myra, just said he needed flour and nails. But at the blacksmith's shop, the old man, one who usually kept his nose out of other people's business, pulled him aside. "Mercer," he muttered. "Heard you've been housing a woman named Jansen." Eli stared him dead in the eye. "I house who I want. That a problem, just saying. Someone's been asking. A lot." Eli returned late, his eyes bloodshot, his satchel heavier than usual. Alongside the flour was a pistol cleaned, loaded, and ready. Myra saw it when he unpacked. She didn't ask. She simply said, "He won't knock on the door. He'll be watching." She was right. The next morning, the chickens were gone. Every single one. No footprints. No blood. Just the coop swung open. Hinges removed clean, a few scattered feathers on the frozen ground. Myra didn't scream. Didn't panic. She just bent down, picked up a handful of feathers, and stood up straight like she was seeing off an old friend. Lisa bit her lip until it bled. Nathan gripped a piece of firewood like a club. That night, Eli slept in the chair by the front door, the pistol resting in his lap. Myra brought him a blanket. He didn't refuse. She didn't speak. But the way her hand brushed his shoulder, gentle and lingering, told him something he hadn't felt in years. Someone was worried for him. Someone other than himself. 3 nights later, Eli came back from another trip into town and saw smoke rising behind the cabin. The old coop was on fire. It wasn't a big blaze, but it was deliberate. Scout howled. The children ran outside. Myra was already throwing water. No one was hurt, but the earth was scorched, and smoke clung to the walls like a warning. But what was inside the cabin hit harder. Above Eli's bed, nailed into the wall, was a torn piece of Myra's apron, burned, frayed, and pinned like a flag. Underneath 3 words, carved deep into the wood with a blade. "She is mine." Myra didn't cry, didn't tremble. She just stood there, her face like stone. Lisa clutched Clara so tight the little girl whimpered. Eli pulled the cloth down and tossed it into the fire. The rage that filled him wasn't hot. It was heavy cold, like stone settling deep in his chest. "Do we leave?" Myra asked. For the first time, her voice wasn't calm. No, Eli said, voice low and firm. "We stay. We show him we're not afraid." From that night on, the cabin wasn't just a place to keep warm. It became a fortress, each person given a role. Eli checked every latch, every window. He taught Nathan how to send smoke signals. Lisa tied fishing line with bells to the back door. Ben started learning how to grip a knife. Myra taught the kids how to breathe without sound, how to hide in the floorboard's shadows. She didn't stop Eli. She didn't shield the kids, because she knew the first thing men like Roland steal is innocence. Eli didn't say it out loud, but each time his eyes fell on Myra, hair tied back, gaze steady, he knew something had changed. This wasn't pity anymore. This was something stronger. This was alliance. This was trust. No one was running now. No one was begging. They stood not because they wanted to, but because they had to. Because this time, if they didn't stand their ground, they'd lose everything. Winter's chill hadn't yet lifted when another kind of cold crept in, not from the sky, but from the northern woods where sunlight never quite reached. It was the kind of stillness Eli Mercer called darkness with shape, that eerie sense when you know someone's watching, but hasn't made a move yet. Myra felt it too. She slept less often, standing at the window in the early dawn, eyes fixed on the forest, as if counting each gust of wind. They both knew Roland wouldn't stop. The warnings were no longer subtle. A broken axe handle lodged upright into the front post like a quiet message. Lisa's red sweater hung from a high branch by a rope, a splintered cabin board with deep knife marks carved into it. "I'll be back." And then he came back. It was a windless afternoon. Nathan was helping Eli reinforce the west fence when they spotted 3 riders approaching in the distance. Roland on a black horse sitting tall like a drawn spear, followed by 2 strangers, one built like a barrel, the other lean and twitchy-eyed. They didn't rush. They didn't hide their faces. They rode in like men returning to land they believed they owned. Eli didn't wait. He stepped onto the porch rifle slung across his shoulder. He didn't raise it, didn't threaten, just stood there still as a carving. Myra appeared behind him, hair tied back, wearing one of Eli's old shirts with worn-out shoulders. In her hand she held the hunting rifle Eli had once hidden in the attic. Roland gave a nod, like a man greeting an old acquaintance. "Myra," he said, voice sweet, like honey left too long in the sun. "You're looking well." She said nothing. "I've come to take you and the kids home." "You never had a home," she replied, voice quiet but solid as stone dropped in a well. Roland's face darkened. The bigger man behind him shifted slightly. But Eli stepped forward just half a pace, not a threat, just enough to make the boundary clear. One more step, and there'd be no turning back. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," Roland muttered, eyes flicking from Myra to Eli. "You think you mean something to her?" Eli answered softly, every word etched in the dirt beneath his boots. "I don't think. I know." Silence stretched between them, 3 heartbeats long. Then Roland smirked. "She's good at making you think you're saving her, but she only knows how to run." He turned to Myra, his voice now like a thrown stone. "You'll run again, just like always." And that was when Myra raised the gun. Her hands didn't shake, her eyes didn't blink. She didn't aim at Roland, didn't need to. She aimed close enough that her first shot sent the lean man into a panic, dropping his pistol and fleeing on horseback. The big one hesitated, cursed, then followed. Only Roland remained. "You don't have the guts," he snarled. Myra didn't fire again, but her eyes, those were the bullets. "I just did." Eli stepped up beside her. "She's not yours anymore." Roland stared at the 2 of them for a long moment. His face twisted through layers, anger, confusion, and finally arrogance. He chuckled low. "All right," he said, turning his horse. "I've got other ways." As he rode off, the hem of his coat dragged a trail in the dust like a snake across Tanbai. But the wind didn't carry his last words away. It nailed them into Eli and Myra's ears like iron hooks. "I'll come back with the law." They said nothing as they stepped inside. The children had been hiding for some time. Scout growled so fiercely, Lisa had to hold him back. Myra placed the gun on the table and poured herself a glass of water, hands still trembling, not from fear, but from the deep knowing that hiding was no longer enough. "You think he'll do it?" she asked. Eli nodded. "He'll use what he thinks is his strongest weapon, his name, his papers, and his lies." Myra nodded slowly. "Then this time, we don't just stand. We prove." Eli looked at her and saw in her eyes something more than survival. He saw fight. For her children. For herself. For the first time she wasn't running. She was walking forward. And Eli, the man who once swore never to love again, knew that if a battle was coming, he'd be damned before he let her walk into it alone. That evening, as the sun began to fall behind the hills, Myra walked straight to the burned-down chicken coop and began clearing the ash. No one asked why. Nathan grabbed a hoe. Lissa brought a bucket of water. Eli picked up his hammer and started measuring new boards. Because they all knew this place wasn't a hiding spot anymore. It was their ground, and from here on out, they would not back down. The news came in a cream-colored envelope sealed in red wax and printed on paper as thick as wedding stationery, but it smelled of cold steel and power. A stranger delivered it clean-cut, well-dressed, riding in from the south. He knocked on the cabin door 3 times, evenly spaced. When Eli answered, the man didn't ask for a name. He simply nodded, handed him the envelope, and said summons. "Concerning Mrs. Myra Jansen and the matter of child custody." He didn't wait for water or words. He turned his horse and disappeared as quickly as he had come. Myra held the paper in her hands. Read it once. Then again. The typeface was sharp as a blade. The message was clear. Roland Jansen had filed charges with the county court, accusing her of kidnapping 5 children and being mentally unfit to care for them. The hearing was scheduled in 10 days, 3 days' ride south. She sat silently by the fire, her eyes fixed on the flames, like she was looking for an answer inside them. Eli said nothing. He stood behind her, his fists clenched at his sides. Finally, Myra spoke. Her voice didn't shake, but the fear was in her eyes. I don't have papers, Eli. No birth certificates, no marriage license, no proof. All they have is their names. And me. And that's enough for me, Eli said. But not for the law. That night, the cabin didn't sleep. Lisa sat sewing up her mother's old cloak, her fingers fast, but her head bowed low. Nathan made a list of what they needed to bring careful and steady, like he was preparing for war. Clara clutched her torn doll and slept at her mother's feet. Myra trimmed her hair, braided it tight, and wrapped it in a scarf like she was putting on armor, not the kind that stops bullets, but the kind that holds you upright under judgmental eyes. 3 days later, they left the cabin before sunrise. Eli drove a small wagon with Myra seated beside him. The children stayed behind with Scout, and an old neighbor Eli trusted Mr. Larson, who lived 5 miles east. Before they left, Clara hugged her mother tight and whispered, "I'll wait for you to come back. Not anyone else. Just you." The road to the courthouse was longer with the headwinds. Myra didn't speak much. Eli didn't ask. But when her hand reached for his beneath the blanket, they both understood this wasn't just her fight anymore. The county courthouse was an aging structure, walls flaking with old paint, but the inside was cold as stone long benches, the stale scent of paper and gunpowder. Roland was already there, polished, hair neatly combed, crisp white shirt, that carefully measured smile. 2 others stood with him, one a relative, the other a bank employee. Both spoke of fatherly responsibility and the mental instability of a woman without a stable home. Myra stood in the witness box, no backrest, no support. She didn't have documents, but she had a voice, and this time she used it. I didn't kidnap my children. I saved them. I left when Nathan asked me why his father hit me, even though I hadn't done anything wrong. I left when Lisa started shaking every time the door opened. I don't have papers, but I have bruises that used to cover my ribs. I have the look in my children's eyes when they stopped being afraid to fall asleep. Silence followed. Even the judge, an old man with cloudy eyes and snow-white hair, lifted his gaze and held it on her. And if I have to choose between the law and survival, she said, I will choose survival. Every time. The hearing ended quickly. No ruling was given on the spot. The judge simply said, I will consider and deliver a decision in writing within the week. Outside the courthouse, Eli helped Myra down the steps. She let out a long breath, not exhausted, not defeated, just the release of someone who had held themselves together for far too long. Do you think I have a chance? She asked. The law isn't always right, Eli said. But the truth is still the truth, and you said it better than any document ever could. On the way home, a light spring rain began to fall, just enough to wash away the dust. But as they reached the ridge near the cabin, a colder feeling ran down their spines than any rain could cause. Smoke was still rising from the chimney, but what was hanging from the porch froze them in place. Clara's torn doll, ripped open, stained with dried blood, had been nailed to the front post with an old hunting knife. No message, no sound. Roland had been there, and he hadn't come with the law. Eli leapt off the wagon. Myra ran to the cabin. Inside, everything was still too still. Then she screamed, not a word, a sound torn from the core. No one was there, not a child, not a trace. Only one thing remained scrawled in chalk on the wooden table. You lose. The trial had been a curtain. The real war had only just begun. The wind sliced across the porch like a thin blade, carving its rhythm into the hollow quiet. The cabin was unnaturally still. No sound of children's footsteps. No Lisa reading aloud to Clara. No Ben fumbling through his harmonica practice. Myra stood frozen in the center of the room, arms wrapped around Clara's torn doll. Her breath caught in her throat as if the words, "You lose," carved into the wooden table, were holding it hostage. Eli said nothing. He moved through the cabin like a hunting animal tracking the last breath of the thieves. No signs of forced entry. No struggle. But the root cellar door had been left open, fresh dirt trailing across the threshold. The children had been taken in silence by someone who knew every corner of the house, someone who didn't need violence to terrify. Roland. "Do you know where he might have taken them?" Myra asked. Her voice sounded so strange that even Eli turned to look. "There's a place," he said after a pause. "A hunting lodge belongs to one of his relatives, south side of the mountain, abandoned for years, remote, no traffic." Myra didn't wait. She tied her hair back, tucked a pistol into her waistband, and walked out the door. Eli followed. They didn't take much, just weapons instinct and a fury that hadn't yet found a name. They rode hard through the forest, crossed snow-packed ravines, forded streams and loose rock. No words. Just the pounding of hooves against earth, relentless, unforgiving, the heartbeat of people with nothing left to lose. The house appeared like a dark scar in the forest. Small, covered in moss. A thin plume of smoke drifted from its crooked chimney. No guards, no signs of alarm. But Eli felt the pressure in the air, the kind of silence that only exists where someone is being kept who shouldn't be. They didn't charge in with gunfire. They approached like the woods had taught them, silent, deliberate. Scout was sent first. The dog moved low to the ground, nose pressed into the dirt. When he whimpered by the doorframe, Eli knew. The children were inside, a sound, shallow breathing, the soft scrape of small feet against old floorboards. Eli glanced at Myra. She nodded. He kicked the door in. Inside, the children were loosely tied, their mouths uncovered, but eyes wide with fear. Nathan stood in front of the others, gripping a piece of wood like a club. Roland sat by the window, a glass of liquor in hand, a pistol on the floor beside him. He looked up and smirked. "Well, there you are," he said, as if welcoming them for afternoon tea. "Finally figured out where you belong." Myra stepped in, gun lowered, but eyes blazing. "Get up," she ordered. Roland raised his glass, sipped. "You won't shoot. You never have. You're a runner." Remember, Eli slipped right, reached for the pistol on the floor, and pulled it out of Roland's reach. The man didn't react. He just stared at Myra. "You really think they belong to you?" "No papers. No names. You're just a fading memory." Myra stepped forward, bent down, picked up the gun, and clicked off the safety. But instead of aiming it at him, she turned away. "Let's go," she said to the children. "We're going home." Lisa ran first, throwing her arms around her mother. Clara sobbed. Ben rushed to Eli. Nathan hesitated, eyes still locked on Roland, then finally stepped back when Myra gave a nod. Roland stood up, swaying. "You haven't changed, Myra. I thought you might be stronger. Turns out you're still that same scared girl, hiding inside her own fear." She paused in the doorway, turned back. "No, Roland. I was. But not anymore." Then, without another word, she walked out. Eli followed. The children filed out behind them into the night wind, small hands gripping each other like they feared the dream might vanish. They returned to the cabin, just as dawn broke. The first sunlight touched the roof like a quiet permission to begin again. Scout ran in circles. Clara slept in Eli's arms. Nathan walked with heavy feet but straight shoulders. Myra, last to enter, still held the gun, but not out of fear. It was the final act of a closed chapter. She looked at the house, once a hiding place, now a place to stand, and for the first time, tears welled in her eyes. Not from pain, but from survival, from coming home. And because this time, no one had been left behind. As for Roland, he stayed in that forest cabin alone, surrounded by empty bottles and a shattered ego. Not killed, not rescued, just left behind in the very darkness he once believed could imprison others. Only now, he was the prisoner. The next morning, light broke through the gray clouds like a quiet song, not loud, but impossible to ignore. The cabin still held the smell of wood-smoke wool blankets, damp earth, and the steady breathing of those who had survived. Myra sat by the fireplace, hair-tangled eyes, swollen from lack of sleep, but her arm rested gently across Clara's back like an anchor finally dropped into solid ground. Beside her, Eli said nothing, only tended the fire with quiet focus, as if that flame was holding together a world that had nearly gone over the edge. No one mentioned Roland. No one needed to. The only thing that remained was a scar, unseen, no longer bleeding, but sometimes aching, just enough to remind them of what they'd made it through. That afternoon, Myra walked out to the chicken coop. She stood there for a long time, staring at the charred wood touching the broken latches, not measuring the damage but the new limits of herself. Nathan brought the hammer. Eli carried the lumber. Ben followed behind with a bucket of nails. No one asked if she wanted to rebuild. They just did it. And Myra, for the first time since arriving on this land, allowed herself to give direction. Set the main post here. Shift it left a bit. The sun hits better for the hens. By the time the last nail was driven in, the sunset cast golden light across the new tin roof like a quiet blessing. Myra stood watching. She didn't smile, but her eyes shimmered with something close to peace. The next morning she asked Eli to go into town with her. He was surprised, but didn't ask why. She wore a simple blue dress and carried a small stack of papers tied with a thin rope. They went to the town hall, a small building with one sagging roof but clean desks inside. The clerk looked up at her, recognition flickering behind unfamiliarity. Name Myra took a breath. I'd like to change it. The clerk blinked. To what name? She glanced at Eli briefly, then looked squarely at the man behind the desk. Myra Cooper. The clerk wrote it down. No questions, just asked any reason. Not for someone, she answered. Just so I don't belong to anyone anymore. The stamp came down on the paper with a flat, dry thud, like a chapter closing. They left town with the afternoon sun leaning west. Eli held the reins. Myra held the paper to her chest. It wasn't a birth certificate. It wasn't a marriage license. But it was the first document she had ever chosen for herself. From that day on, the cabin changed not in big ways, but just enough to notice. Scout slept by the door every night. Clara laughed out loud. Nathan started fixing the porch roof. Lissa planted beans behind the house. Ben learned how to whittle without cutting his hands. And Myra, she let her hair grow longer, hung Clara's drawing on the wall, and built a small wooden shelf above the fireplace for useless but beautiful things. A green stone, a cracked bird egg, a family photo no one remembered taking. Eli never asked about the name change. But one night, as they sat on the porch watching stars rise over the ridge, he said softly, "That name suits you." She turned and smiled, soft as breath. "It's mine now. It wasn't a wedding. There were no rings, no vows. But after that day, folks around the valley started calling them Mr. and Mrs. Cooper, and neither of them ever felt the need to correct it." A month later, Myra wrote her first words in an old notebook, March. "The earth is soft. Time to plant." It wasn't a memo. It wasn't a diary. Just proof that she was still here, no longer hiding, no longer afraid. The cabin wasn't a refuge anymore. It was home, not because of the walls or the roof, but because the people inside no longer treated the past like something shameful. They lived together, not because they owed each other anything, but because each of them had made the choice to stay. And Myra, now Myra Cooper, was no longer the silent figure slipping through the forest. She was the woman standing in the morning light, shovel in hand, eyes on the garden. And behind her was a family, a real one. Summer always came late in Wren Valley, but when it did, it brought with it a soft kind of light, like the earth's quiet apology after a long, bitter winter. In the garden behind the cabin, the rows of beans stood tall under the sun. The apple tree Nathan had grown from a seed was budding white blossoms. Ben chased Scout across the sloping field, his laughter echoing like the half-finished harmonica notes he used to play as a boy. And on the front porch, where pain loss and even blood had once soaked into the wood, Eli and Myra Cooper sat each evening, saying little, just watching. Time didn't erase the memories, but it made the scars less raw. The children, once small and quiet, had grown each carrying a piece of Myra, a piece of Eli, and so much of their own. Nathan now lived in a house he built himself near the chestnut grove, married with a son named August and a dog named Ranger. Lisa left the mountains at 22, studied bookkeeping, married a traveling book salesman, and named her first daughter, Myra. Ben, good Lord, he shot up like corn after rain, learned woodworking from an old craftsman out west, and had helped repair almost every house in the valley. Tommy became the village school teacher, writing on the board with his left hand and drawing maps with his right. And Clara, the little girl who used to sleep with her finger in her mouth, traveled, told stories, painted, and said her first memory was the sound of her mother's wooden clogs on the cabin floor. Myra still kept the old notebook. The first page read March. The earth is soft. Time to plant. Over the years, she filled it in not by dates, but by milestones. Lisa embroidered her first hem. Nathan held a girl's hand for the first time. Eli broke the honey jar. Clara laughed instead of cried. The spine was frayed, the corners water-damaged, but every line inside it was proof, quiet and solid, that she once unseen and on the run had lived, had built, had chosen to stay. Some evenings, Eli would still head out back, fixing the gate, patching the chicken coop, or simply hauling a shovel for tasks no one asked for, but he deemed necessary. Myra would bring out cornbread on a tray, sit beside him on the steps. They didn't talk much about the past, not because they'd forgotten, but because they no longer needed the telling to remember who they were. They sat together sometimes, holding hands, sometimes leaning shoulder to shoulder, looking out at the green field Roland once tried to turn into a grave, but where Clara now planted purple corn every April. People in town spoke of them now, with respect not for what they had been through, but for the life they lived. Children were brought to learn to read with Lisa, to hear Mr. Tommy's stories of the Old West, or to learn from Nathan how to fell a tree without splitting the bark. And when someone asked, who was Myra Cooper, the answer often came, she's the woman who never backed down, even when the whole world told her she should. And that was true. Myra didn't need a title. She didn't need a statue. She had carved her name into this land with calloused hands, with her refusal to abandon her children, with her decision not to hand over her fear to someone else. She was never a victim. She was a mother. A woman who laid every stone of her home not with brick, but with courage, trust, and a love so quiet it never once retreated. Eli knew he was getting old. His hands weren't as steady, his eyes a little dimmer. But his heart, each time he saw Myra watering the plants or mending something for the grandkids, beat like it did the day he first opened his cabin door to that woman. Love for him hadn't come like fever, but like a seasoned slow steady, and here to stay. And maybe that was the greatest legacy they left behind. That love didn't need to be fierce, it just needed to be chosen again every day. That family wasn't always blood. It was the people who held on when the storm came. And that standing still was sometimes the bravest thing of all, especially when the world said you should run. If you've ever wondered whether it's possible to rebuild a life from wreckage, remember Myra Cooper's story. A woman who once had nothing but willpower and now has a family, a community, and a patch of earth no one can take from her. And if she could do it, after all those years of running after being told she didn't deserve to try, then maybe, just maybe, so can you. All it takes is to stop running. All it takes is to choose. And above all else, don't give up. Open that door again like she once did, not just to welcome the lost, but to invite those who want to learn how to stand as she did. A little classroom, a shared garden, a place to retell the story not for pity, but so others will know surviving is a form of victory. And to love quietly, daily, fiercely is the boldest resistance of all.